Okay, hello, and welcome to this eCampus News webinar, Protecting Your Organization Through Vendor Risk Management. My name is Kevin Hogan. I am the editor-at-large for eCampus News, and I am happy you are joining us today for what I know will be a very insightful and important conversation. This event is brought to you by Honorlock, ranked number 103 in the 2001 Inc. 5000 fastest growing private companies. Honorlock provides online proctoring software and services to higher education institutions and organizations. Honorlock strives to make the online proctoring experience simple, easy, and human. Its on-demand proctoring solution combines AI and live test proctors to support students and faculty while protecting academic integrity. Used by several of the largest universities in the US, Honorlock is dedicated to providing world-class service and support 24/7, 365. Now, before we get into our conversation, I'd like to take a minute to go over some of the features of the platform that we're using for this webinar. The event is being recorded, so you don't have to worry about missing a thing. Within a few days, you'll receive an email message that contains a link to the recorded webinar, along with the PDF of the slides. If you have a question or comment for the panelists, which I highly encourage you to participate in, as we have two very insightful folks here. There is a chat function that you can launch by clicking on it. Feel free to use this feature to also contact someone from the eCampus News team if you have a technical question. So with these housekeeping items out of the way, let's get started with our conversation and introductions. And with that, Kirk, I'll pass it over to you.
All right, thanks so much, Kevin. My name is Kirk Corey. I'm the Director of Policy and Privacy here at the University of Iowa. My background has been mostly in higher education. I've worked in several different areas at the university here, the School of Music, the Department of Sponsored Programs, and also the College of Law, prior to taking on my current role, which involves third-party risk management. I also spent 5 years working for a private software development company. So I have a little bit of insight also into what that world is like and what it takes in order to be able to bring products to market. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to my co-presenter, Paul Morales.
Thanks, Kirk. Hello, everyone. Thanks for attending today. My name's Paul Morales. I'm the head of security and technology at Honorlock. Prior to this, I was working in the aviation defense space, and I've done a few stints at various software companies and in the healthcare space also. My background is in information security and technology. I also have a minor in cyber forensics on the investigation side. So I'm really excited to talk to you about the items that have come up today and going through our agenda. Let's dive in. So just a brief kind of overview on our agenda today, some of the key takeaways on the conversation. So we're going to first cover what is a risk management program, what does it mean on both sides of the coin, both the vendor side and on the institutional side. One of the key tools that we use in risk management, utilizing a risk matrix, we'll actually run through how that's used. We'll also talk about some tips to establish that risk management program, what you should do depending on where you are in the process, right? We're going to have folks that are at varying levels in their maturity around their risk management program. And then we're also going to have different stakeholders. So what does it look like from wherever your seat may be? And then finally, we'll talk about some specific best practices around vendor security. All right, so to start off with the basics instead of foundation, let's talk about what exactly a vendor risk management program looks like. So this really in a nutshell is a process to identify, assess, and mitigate risks associated with third-party vendors that have access to any sensitive information, systems, or networks. If we break it out into its three highest level steps, it is the identify. So what is the actual risk? Then you go to assess what is involved with the risk, and then mitigate what it is that we can do to avoid or minimize the risk. It can also include some more complex concepts such as risk transfer and risk financing, but we won't dive into those specifically today. The goal of such a program is to ensure that vendors are held to the same information security standards and best practices as the organization that's hosting it. And how this kind of came to fruition is essentially most services, if not all, were previously performed by the institution themselves, or maybe a handful of trusted providers. Now, with the advent of the internet, more interconnectivity, and software as a service, we depend on organizations more than ever. This means that our vendor security becomes our security. So even a more elementary way to think of this is that old adage about a chain and its weakest link. Kirk, is there anything else you'd like to add on this one?
Sure. Yeah, just to kind of echo what you're saying there. One of the things that's really important as you're developing your risk management program, we're going to be talking mostly about third-party risk, vendor risk, but making sure that as you're working on this program that you're keeping it aligned with how you measure your risk internally. One of the things that we've experienced here at Iowa is that we focus so much on the third-party risk that it got a little bit out of sync with how we were looking at our internal risk. And so it's just something to think about, that you're looking at all the risks with a similar level of scrutiny.
That's a great point. Absolutely. It's very hard to try and dictate to an external or a third party what exactly you need if you're not really keeping up with what you're needing specifically yourself for your own institution. So I think a great point there. All right. So one of the things I think is really interesting to see year over year is something called the Verizon Breach Report that comes out, and it talks about what has happened in the previous year around security and privacy. And it's kind of it's an interesting way to see how things are trending. And one of the most concerning ones are the fact that as of last year, 60% of breaches originate from a third party. Let that settle in, right? More than half of breaches originate from a third party, not actually the organization that is breached initially. So a well-defined vendor risk management program can have a significant impact on information security by reducing the risk of these data breaches, the cyber attacks, and other security incidents caused by third-party vendors. One of the key ways that we're seeing this happening more and more are what are called supply chain attacks, which essentially the attacker targets a third-party vendor or supplier that has organization access, right, to applications or data. So think a third-party vendor, whatever the case may be. And by compromising the security of the vendor or the supplier, the attacker can gain unauthorized access to the organization's information security systems and data. These types of attacks can be very problematic because they tend to go undetected for longer periods of time. So one of the things that we want to highlight today is how this vendor risk management or third-party risk management program helps to prevent a breach. And by utilizing a program like this, you're able to ensure that third-party vendors are held to that same standard that you set aside for yourself as an organization. And because of this, you're reducing the likelihood of a data breach caused by a vendor. And then almost as important as that is, how do you make sure you protect your brand and reputation and avoid any damage to that? So it helps to really show that you have a strong due diligence process. Any kind of security incident can absolutely cause reputational damage or loss of trust, especially in higher ed. And then it also ensures that vendors are meeting their contractual obligations and that the organization's reputation isn't compromised by subpar performance by a vendor. Kirk, anything on that one you'd like to?
Yeah, just a couple of things to add, and these are all great points. One additional thing is that, within higher ed, you have a lot of laws and regulations that you're subject to. You have a lot of contractual agreements. Any of those may require you to have a third-party risk management program. So, for example, we're looking right now at making sure that we're all in line and ready for the new FTC safeguards rule that affects us under GLBA. And so one of the things that's called out in there is, do you have a third-party risk management program? Another thing to keep in mind of the kind of risks that you're trying to manage, lost revenue is a huge thing. And so when you're looking at what kind of risks you're trying to avoid, some of these risks can cause you to, lose money. And that's something that, depending on the audience that you're talking to and why you're explaining why risk management is important, a lot of people really understand the word money.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Sometimes that is the main way to get a lot of other folks involved in the process, because it does come down to dollars and cents and making it measurable. So great point there. All right. So next, we're going to talk about one of the tools, right? So, there's a lot of theory and kind of basic elementary knowledge around, how to build out a program. But, you're probably here to hear a little bit more of like, well, I get that this is something and it's important. What would you suggest are some of my first steps? So I always think it's great to kind of show some of the tool sets that we may use in order to manage this, whether it's on the vendor side, which I exist on, or it is the like, for example, in Kirk's situation where he is assessing vendors and assessing their stance on privacy and security and those types of things. These types of tools can be applied on both sides. So what we're looking at right now is a risk management matrix, and we can we can use this to actually help to measure and assess risk. So an example of this would be, if you look at your far left-hand column, you have something where you can outline a risk. So say, for example, there's a vendor that we would like to use, but they do not have a third-party audit in place. The likelihood of a concern or this causing a breach or damage to our reputation, right? This is completely up to you to make a call or a choice on. The beauty of something like this, and I'll give an example of when I've seen something like this play out. And I'm sure Kirk has had some good examples of it too, is it's something that you can revisit and understand why you made a decision or why things were prioritized one over another, right? So this is something where you're using don't want to say guess, but you're using your best assessment based on what you have to assign some type of level of likelihood of something happening or probability. And then the next column, we have impact, right? So if this were to happen, how would it impact our organization, right? Because as human beings, we tend to kind of do a lot of things based on gut feeling. So something may be a catastrophic impact, but have a very low likelihood. And we'll see in this exercise, and if you play around with this yourself, you'll see that sometimes that does not mean that the thing that's catastrophic but has a very low likelihood should be what is actually prioritized. Something that's much more of a moderate risk can actually cause a lot more issues for you as an organization because it's much more likely to happen, if that makes sense. Then we have a risk rating. So this is coming back from when we reference our two previous columns to our matrix at the bottom. What do we come back as far as a risk rating? And then finally, we have an action and mitigation. So what things we're going to do in order to either track or take action on this risk, right? So the risk may include making certain changes, or in our example, if the vendor does not have a SOC report. Well, sometimes that may be a disqualifying event, right? But sometimes it may be a very small subset of vendors that offer the service that you're looking for, and you really need them to provide that service. So what you do is you put in maybe in this one, we put in some contractual terms that they'll have a third-party audit, such as a SOC 2 report or an ISO 27001 by a certain date. And then we're able to track back to that. So it's not a matter of 6 months from now, hey, I remember something was going on with that vendor, let me dig through it. You can revisit this and understand exactly what needed to happen. Kirk, can you talk about some of your experience using tools like this?
Yeah, it's important to understand, when you're getting started with a tool like this, it can be a little bit confusing because you look at it and you say likelihood, oh, how do I pick the number for that? Impact, how do I pick the number for that? It's both an art and a science, so that it's something that you learn to do over time. You make your best guess, and what you try to do is to make sure that you're not being influenced too much by loud voices. If somebody comes to you and says, "Oh, we really need to have it. We really need to have it," don't bump the risk down because somebody's really anxious. Make sure that you try to do your best job at accurately reflecting the risk, and then, like Paul says, go in and start to think about what are those safeguards that you're going to put in. When you talk about assessing risk, you have inherent risk and you have residual risk. So kind of to use a real world example, the inherent risk is if you're driving your car without your seatbelt on. And the residual risk is the risk that remains after you put your seatbelt on. So a lot of our risk management program here focuses on what are the controls that we're going to ask people to implement in order to put that risk down as low as we can.
Absolutely. No, great point. Great point with that. And I saw another, not necessarily conventional usage of a similar type of matrix. You'll see these types of tools popping up in different parts of cybersecurity and privacy practice. But one example that I saw, I was doing some consulting with a small software company, and they really were starting to have some issues as they were growing, getting some notoriety, having some issues with their security practices and developing secure code. So one of the things, which I'm sure, Kirk, with your experience, working in the software world, I'm sure this is all too familiar. They were so concerned about, there's a plethora, there's an infinite amount of security issues that exist. How do I actually prioritize what I work on, right? So they went from, this being the nightmare that kept them up every single night because they did not want to do the wrong thing. They didn't want to take a shortcut, but they were operating on gut feeling. That's all they did, is operate on gut, right? So something seems really bad, it's a catastrophic. Well, what's the possibility of that happening? Well, it's extremely low. So what we did is we introduced this tool into the session. It was an hour-long session, and we took their list of open items and we said, okay, let's go through it and essentially vote on how we feel about these things. And by the end of the session, you can kind of see like, wow, we actually have some clarity on what things are actually priority, and the things that we weren't so concerned with are actually things we should be tackling first. And those big major ones, we know they're there, but sometimes those risks, there isn't much that you can do, or it's not economical to actually address them, which is something that's a reality with this, and we'll dive a little bit deeper into. But I thought it was interesting, a non-conventional example of how these types of matrices can be used in different scenarios. All right, perfect. Kirk, I think you want to go ahead and take this one.
Sure. So some of the things that you want to think about when you're establishing your risk management program or as you're maintaining it, first of all, you want to have a policy that you're working from, and how you have that policy laid out. Different institutions have different policy management and creation processes. So you want to think about that as you're trying to get the program started. You also want to have a vendor selection process that is documented and that you can point to what the steps are for that. This kind of goes to the point that your third-party risk management program is going to involve a lot of different groups within your university working together. So I'm within the information security office, but in order to make this work, we work very closely, obviously, with purchasing. We work very closely with our general counsel's office for contract review. We work with a lot of different customer stakeholders that have their own requirements for how risk is managed for them. And you want to rely as much as you can on those contractual standards. You want to get your language put together up front before you go to the vendors, and you want to be able to say to them, hey, this is what we require. And for us, that's a layered approach. We do that both in the RFQ process, where we tell vendors, if you're submitting a proposal to us, we want you to understand up front, this is what we expect. And if this is going to be a problem, let's talk about that now before you put a lot of time into submitting a proposal to us. And then you also want to make sure that you come back at the point where you are, accepting a contract with a vendor and making sure that all of that's still included in there. Some of the other things, if you're really starting from scratch, you want to figure out, okay, not only who are the people that are going to be participating in this program, but who are the stakeholders that are looking to see value in it, and what are the things that they want to see. And so if you're trying to start from the very beginning and you don't have a program at all, you want to look for stories that will resonate with people. You want to look at things that have happened in the past at your institution, both good and bad, that people are familiar with, and then also, you know, things that have happened at peer institutions. You know, if one of the universities that you see yourself being similar to is getting bad publicity, you want to be able to point to that and say, well, here's a way to make sure that doesn't happen to us. Paul, what would you like to add to that?
I mean, I think those are all great points. I think that you know, it's taking it and not trying to bite off too much at once, right? So I think the approach that you've laid out here, and making sure that you're involving stakeholders, it's one of the things that I think is most easily missed. And you know, if there is not cooperation of all of the involved parties and stakeholders in this process, then I have seen it gone, you know, it can go sideways very easily. But I think once you actually implement this, you implement it slowly, you introduce folks, you help them understand the why behind it. You'll find yourself having a lot more champions of this type of program than you would really expect. And I think as time is going on, it's far less dependent on folks like Kirk and myself to really push these things forward. I'm seeing more and more adoption of it by folks in the ranks, which is great. You know, you're seeing folks really take privacy and security seriously, even though it's not in their specific job title, because at the end of the day, it does end up becoming everybody's job. So I think that's a great way to look at it.
Yeah, and looking at these additional points that are laid out here, these are also very important. As you're working on your risk management program, a lot of people think, you know, there's an assessment that's done at a point in time and then you're done and everything's happy, but it really doesn't work that way. You do need to have due diligence and ongoing monitoring. That's one of the things that we emphasize in our review process, is to say, okay, this vendor is operating in a space where there are lots of breaches happening all the time. So you have to kind of keep your ear to the ground, make sure that you're following them to see what's going on. We divide that up at our university for things that are campus wide. A lot of that monitoring happens within our central office. If somebody wants to have a one-off system, then we push that responsibility back to them and say, you know, part of the price of having a separate system from the campus system is that you've got to take on this responsibility of monitoring the vendor over time. The internal vendor risk management audit process, that's something that's very important. Our program really was born out of a requirement from our internal audit department as we began to move more and more of our services to the cloud. Our internal auditors raise the question to say, you know, we have a lot of different area kind of levels of scrutiny that we're applying for this. For some cloud services, we're looking at them very, very carefully and we're being very thoughtful about it. And for others, you know, somebody's pulling out their procurement card and making a purchase and then saying afterwards, oh, I hope I did the right thing. Could you review it for me? And so that's one of the things that really established our program was having that requirement from internal audit. And then having a comprehensive reporting process is important so that you can periodically update people who are not really close to the nuts and bolts of this, but to be able to give them a picture to say, how are we doing with this? So, you know, the president of your university doesn't want to have a daily update on this, but at some point they want to know, you know, are you keeping up with this, or are there areas of concern that we need to be aware of? And so that's something also that's very important, making sure that you've got the reports in place, making sure that you're keeping updated with any of the documentation that you're requiring from the vendors. So, you know, you get your SOC 2 report, that's good for a period of time. You want to make sure that you get a new one when the old one expires. Same thing under PCI, really important to make sure that your attestations of compliance are kept up to date. Paul, anything you'd like to add to that?
Absolutely. Great points again. I would say on the top bullet point, just one thing to highlight or tag on, and I see it mentioned here, but I think it's just so important is there is a lot of work that goes into really maintaining this program long term, but don't let that lead to shortcuts such as I've seen or heard of organizations where they're like, yeah, we require a SOC report. And I say, like, how often do you actually review them? And it's more of a check mark item, right? I need to get a SOC report from a vendor. Well, did you actually take a look at it, right? Because a SOC report, which some people may or may not know, does not necessarily indicate that they don't have any security or privacy issues. It's just a third-party review of what's happened in that organization during a period of time. There can be several exceptions that can be documented in the report that would kind of give you a little bit of an inside look of some of the issues that may be happening with the organization, or at least areas that you want to stay very much focused on. So not only requesting the report, I would say actually reading it through, asking questions. It should prompt questions for you. Paying attention to how many trust principles. Are they doing all of the trust principles? If they're not, why not? And then, one of the things we'll touch on a little bit later, but the incident response, I think, absolutely key, right? Making sure that they do have a plan if something goes wrong. Cannot emphasize that enough. So no, I think great points here with that. And I think very much highlight some of the things that you need to keep in mind. There is a lot, but don't let it, like I said, bite size, take it one step at a time, identify which things are priority, get those stakeholders, and then continue to improve upon the program. The program is not going to be in a finished state initially. All right, so on this next slide, we're essentially just kind of showing, some of the examples. These are just some examples. This is not considered to be comprehensive, but the key takeaway is that you can use these types of resources or tools or questions to help kind of customize the types of questions or requirements that you need to meet your specific institutional needs. It also is something to provide some ideas on what you should put in there if you're not sure what to start off with. One thing we do like to highlight, as Kirk already alluded to, right? Remember, doing a vendor assessment or a security questionnaire will add time to the procurement cycle. So he already mentioned working with those folks. So make sure you account for that additional time in your project timeline to allow for that due diligence. So you're not getting that pressure that Kirk kind of mentioned, those loud voices. It kind of sounds silly when we talk about it, but we've all probably experienced that type of thing. And it's just not a pressure that is absolutely necessary, especially when you want to be vigilant to see what's going on with the organization. So I would say there's a couple examples here. I guess, Kirk, you want to, provide an example of maybe based on something that you've seen associated with this list. I think maybe the incident and security reporting.
Oh yeah. The last bullet's really a big one for us. A lot of the things that we get from third-party vendors, are really critical pieces of infrastructure for our institution. And so we had an event just a few weeks ago where there was an outage with one of our most important vendors, and the vendor never reported the outage to us. We found out internally, and that's okay that you might notice it yourself first before you receive the email. But when we went back and we looked in the contract, we found there was no requirement for the vendor ever to alert us on any outage at all. And so that gave us an opportunity to kind of reflect on our own process and say, why isn't that included in the standard TNC? For some of your vendors, it's not a big deal. Some of your systems can be down for a period of time without a lot of impact because they're only used occasionally. But this was something that was public facing and was really kind of a big deal. And so when we realized that there was no requirement from the vendor to alert us at all, we said, well, okay, that's something we have to change. And you change it for that vendor, but you try to do it in a way so that you're changing it for all of your vendors. So you're learning from the experience and you're not having to go back and do it individually for everybody, but again, putting it in your standard terms and conditions. Another thing that has recently come to light, a lot of our third-party vendors that are providing web-based platforms are including various third-party cookie tracking mechanisms in their product. And that has recently come to light because there's a lot more scrutiny on that now from a privacy standpoint. And so that's something too, where we're looking to update our T's and C's to say, hey, if you're using cookies, you got to disclose those up front so we know what they are and we know whether it's acceptable.
Great point. Great point there, Kirk. I would say one of the examples that I always like to throw out around the business continuity and disaster recovery is, right now we're talking specifically around, things that this may be of the view of ed tech or technology specifically tied to education, but in a lot of scenarios, there may be other solutions that you may have. For example, something that may handle payroll. And it's really important that you check on it for that also, right? So I always like to say, how many paychecks do you feel like you would like to miss before you start to question your job? So if you're using a payroll system, I would say that is a business critical system. People need to get paid. So how are you making sure that they have business continuity and disaster recovery in place? Or at least if they do not have something that's satisfactory to you, do you have a backup plan to that? So, do they have data resiliency? How long do they keep their backups for? What are they doing to protect against ransomware, those types of things? And if it were to happen, which it has happened to several high profile payroll companies, what would you do in a situation like that? How much of an effect would it have? And as Kirk alluded to earlier, this can really change a decision once those dollars and cents come into play, right? Like, what is it that this would actually cost us if we were to have an issue because of this? And that can make one vendor eke out another one very quickly. So here's some examples of some pre-configured question sets that are listed here. Some of them may be more familiar to the audience today than others, but we don't really want to highlight on specifically what these are and what specifically they're used for. But we want to really understand, why are there so many different options out there? And one of the things that we want you to walk away with today is understanding it's because different groups work on them. So for example, the HECVAT, which most of us are probably very familiar with, or have at least heard in passing, is really geared towards higher ed. Whereas some of the other ones in here are geared towards other industries or other specific areas of focus. So, it's just like a lot of the other things that we presented today. There is no one right way. These are just some additional resources that you can look at to help build that custom questionnaire. But Kirk, did you have anything on these or experience with these?
Yeah, this reminds me of looking at this list here of that saying from the famous computer science professor Andrew Tannenbaum. The great thing about standards is there's so many to choose from. So, what we need to do in order to make our vendor assessment process effective is to make sure that we're able to use, multiple different resources depending on what the vendor has available. So, like Paul said, if you're a vendor who operates primarily or largely within the higher education space, then there's a good chance that you'll have a HECVAT. If you're not targeted towards that, then you probably won't. So you need to make sure that your program can use a combination of these in order to be able to work effectively. Another resource that probably should be mentioned here, we touched on previously, is the SOC 2 type report, which is another way of looking at, what is the vendor doing? What are their practices? And the great thing about that is that it's a third-party report. So that takes a little bit of bias out of the equation. On the flip side, it can be hard to read. And so if you haven't looked at it before, the first time that you see one, prepare yourself for spending a little bit of time becoming familiar with the format and learning how to interpret it.
Absolutely. Do not recommend reviewing around bedtime.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think with that, Kevin, we've kind of ran through our, our basic fundamentals and the setting the groundwork for understanding that.
Great. Well, thanks, guys. Been a lot to unpack. in those insights and in that presentation. But one thing we want to do is to reach out to the audience and ask, what challenges are you facing in managing or creating your risk management program? And again, I encourage you to use the chat function to go in and tell us what those issues have been for you. In the meantime, Paul, maybe you can provide some SOC 2 examples while we wait for the audience to chime in.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say one of the ones that going around and talking to different folks in different groups, one of the most simple, more annoying ones to happen, because there's a little bit of back and forth that happens during the process, is you may ask for a third-party report, a SOC 2 or ISO 27001. And it, pretty much this day and age, most folks are using one of the 3 or 4 major hosting providers, whether it's AWS, Google, Oracle, Microsoft, Azure, whatever the case may be, to provide their solution. And one of the things that I've seen happen just more and more is when you're asking for these SOC 2 reports, they actually share the hosting provider's SOC 2 reports. So I would say that can be very frustrating, because there's any of us who have participated in this, you can see there's a lot of back and forth, and sometimes there's days, if not weeks, in between time of response. So you can lose a lot of time when somebody sends you something that is not the thing that you need. So you're asking for a SOC report for the vendor specifically, and it comes back to you and it's like, oh, here's AWS's SOC report. So one of the things that I've learned to do over time is actually kind of preface that with, we are not asking for that. So just kind of calling out in the beginning, we are asking specifically for your SOC report as an individual organization, and not the SOC report of your hosting provider. And just saying that it's okay. If you do not have one, that's okay. Please just let us know. So I don't know. Have you seen that one before, Kirk?
Oh, many, many times. And so, yeah, it's frustrating that vendors still think that that's what we're looking for. And it's also frustrating because of the added time. Once you get past that, though, and you should keep in mind, a lot of companies are not going to have a SOC 2 report because it's extra time and money for them. It's not free, and it's a lot of work, working with the assessor to get that report created. But if you're working in a space, that has sensitive data, or if you're working in a space where you're providing a critical piece of infrastructure, then it's really important to see that the vendor has that or something similar to it. Once you get past that hurdle, and once you get to the vendor providing their own SOC report, like I mentioned previously, you need to prepare yourself up front to spend a little bit of time familiarizing yourself with the format of the report. I had a report just yesterday that I was reading, and it took me a lot of time before I was able to dig through the kind of opaque knowledge that's typical of these reports to see that there was a line in there that was basically saying the auditors had limited themselves to inventorying the organization's controls. They didn't actually measure to see whether the controls were working. And so that's a point at which you say, okay, you've scoped this really, really narrowly. So is it because you just didn't have enough time and money, or do you really not have confidence that your controls are effective? And so that's something just to kind of understand, is that unlike say PCI, AOC, where once you've gone through that, it's really easy to understand that line by line. The SOC 2 format is very, very different. And so again, just prepare yourself that it'll take you a little bit of time, the first few that you analyze, in order to see what they really mean and what they're telling you.
Yeah. Now, Kirk, how has the increased adoption of security reviews reduced shadow IT challenges at the University of Iowa?
So that's a great question. Shadow IT is always a challenge for a number of reasons, and the risk posed by it is, a really big reason. A few things that we've done here to help with this. First of all, the people who work through the review process all understand the importance that if you've already got a platform that's approved for use, that's already been reviewed, that's going to make your life easier. Because if you're trying to advocate for a different platform, there's going to be work that comes back to you. You're going to have to gather information up front in order to get through the review process. And it's very likely that there's going to be ongoing monitoring that's going to be assigned to you as part of the cost of adopting an alternate platform. So that's one of the things that's been helpful. One example that comes to mind, most of us probably have kind of a standard platform that we use at our institutions for for file storage. So, for example, our institution, we're using Office 365, Microsoft 365. A lot of institutions use Google, there's Box, there's Dropbox, there's all sorts of different platforms. We're standardized on one platform, and we had an internal customer come to us and say, yeah, I don't want to use that one. I want to use this other one. I want you to tell us it's okay. And we said, well, it's okay, but you have to understand it's okay if you do all these other things, because our standard platform is one where we've done a lot of work within the security office to embed monitoring and reporting and alerting so that we're aware of what's going on within that platform. We're looking out for, people stealing accounts. We're looking out for lots of data getting moved at once, which might be an indication of exfiltration. We have lots and lots of monitoring set up, and we're responsible for that. If you adopt a different platform, you have to build that. We can't build that for two platforms. We don't have the resources. It's not possible. So yeah, you can go ahead and do it if you hire six people to do the monitoring work for you. And at that point, they said, okay, tell us about the regular platform. That's sounding better now.
Right. Now, I know recently the University of Nebraska suffered a data breach, and every day there seems to be another institution of higher learning that is dealing with these sort of issues. Kirk, what has this event taught other higher ed institutions about what they need to do to secure themselves?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The Nebraska Medical Center breach was one that got a lot of attention on our campus because we also have a very large healthcare component as part of our campus. I don't know specifically that there was a third-party risk that was a trigger for this, but I think that what's really important about this and about learning from the mistakes of others and kind of generating an awareness that we can all share among institutions is understanding what the risks were. When we talk about the risk within the healthcare space, a lot of people tend to focus really quickly on what's the cost of the HIPAA fine. If there's a HIPAA breach, what's the cost of the fine? And they kind of zero in on that as if that were the only thing to be concerned about or the most important thing to be concerned about. And when we think about what we've learned from the Nebraska breach, HIPAA fines are very, very important, but when you look at what the impact was on the organization, and when you look at what the impact was on the clients, on the customers, on the patients, the HIPAA breach the HIPAA fine may not really be the thing to zero in on. When you look at the costs of remediation, the costs of cleanup, the costs that this has on your staff as they're dealing with the extra work, as they're dealing with the extra stress. And then when you look at the impact on the patients, when you see a lot of patient care was delayed while they were doing this cleanup, that has an impact on the patient because they're not getting necessarily the care that they need to be getting. And it has an impact on your revenue. If you have to scale back operations, that means that there's money that's not coming in, but you're still paying your employees, you're still keeping the lights on, you're still paying your bills. So that's a really big part of it. And then specific to that incident, there's class action damages. And so that can also be a really big thing that you need to factor in. So when you go back to the security risk matrix and you're trying to measure the impact, make sure you're talking to the right people. Make sure you have the right group of people in the room that are looking at the impact from all different angles so that you're really assessing that correctly. some of you may remember back in the 90s, Microsoft had this big thing. Their big slogan was 5 nines, 99.99% uptime. And everybody was like, oh yeah, 5 nines. We have to have 5 nines. If you can't do 5 nines, we don't want to work with you. It's really not true across the board. If you're working in the healthcare space, yeah, you have to have everything working all the time because your ER has people coming in and you can't say, wait until the system's back online. You have to have systems that are highly available. But if you look at something like your learning management system, you want that to be available all the time. It's important to be available all the time. But if that goes down for a day, I remember in the days before we had learning management systems, if you couldn't have class for a day, that was called a snow day. And it wasn't a big deal. You got past it. You might do a makeup at the end of the semester, but by and large, the students are not saying, give me part of my tuition back because I missed a day. The students are saying, oh, we get a day off. That's great. So it's something to keep in mind as you're looking at availability. For some systems, it's super important. For other systems, it's less important. For a system that you only use once every 2 or 3 weeks, yeah, don't worry about availability so much. Focus on other things.
Great. That's great stuff. I guess a question I have for both you, Kirk, and Paul, is risk management the same at every institution, or are there unique considerations that each institution should keep in mind when they're looking at these various aspects of risk management? Paul, maybe I'll jump on you with this one first.
Yeah, so I guess the short answer to that is no, it's not the same at every institution. There are certain things that I would say are very similar at a foundational level. So foundationally, if you're speaking specifically information security, at the end of the day, we're trying to protect that CIA triad, right? The confidentiality, the availability, and the integrity of the data that you have, right? And I think that at most places, that's going to be the core to the program and the core to making sure that you're assessing and measuring and mitigating risk. I think Kirk's previous example really drives home how it can be different for different institutions, even different colleges or campuses within the university system. So as Kirk mentioned, people spend a lot of time looking at availability. One of the things I was just thinking about, Kirk, is like as we're kind of talking through that, those extra nines of uptime actually get more and more expensive with the more nines that are added, right?
Yes.
And
yes.
I would say absolutely what the vendor is going to do whenever the vendor has an additional cost, think of where that's going to go. It's going to go to the consumer, right? It's going to go to the purchaser of the solution. So if, as Kirk outlined it, and in this example, is it the same for every institution? No. If you're assessing something that does not require that availability, you might be able to get a much better deal with another solution, assuming that everything else is in line with what you're looking for. And then I think by nature, a mature risk management program is not going to look like any other mature risk management program, because a mature risk management program takes into consideration what you need specifically for your institution. And while you may be very similar, no two are the same. Kirk, go ahead. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, those are great points. Looking at how much of an impact availability has, on a platform by platform basis is an important point. Also making sure that regardless of what the vendor offers in terms of assurances and maintaining that availability, outages can happen to anybody. So making sure that as part of your assessment process, you understand what you're doing internally to mitigate that risk, so that if a platform does become available, you have a plan in place how you pivot to doing something else until the platform is available again. In terms of the differences among institutions, I talked a little bit about the fact that we have a large healthcare enterprise here. And so that's a big component for us. If your institution doesn't have a healthcare enterprise, then those concerns don't belong to you. We're also a very large research organization, and the kind of research that you do has an impact on how you do these assessments, because different kinds of research have different requirements. if your institution, for example, does a lot of research that's sponsored by the DoD, then you're familiar with the fact that the requirements for that kind of research are very high. And so that's something that's going to be a lot of focus for you. All of these different kinds of agencies and also private companies that sponsor research, they have different requirements that are built into their contracts and that are built into the regulations. And so part of your program is trying to establish a baseline and an area of commonality that is shared by multiple different kinds of regulations and contracts. And then once you've got that baseline established, then figuring out, okay, this particular tool that's being requested, this is going to fall into this added set of compliances. And so I have to remember to review for all of those compliances as well before I push the OK button.
Yeah. Hey, question coming in from the audience here. Kirk mentioned ensuring an organization's standard contract template include requiring a vendor to report any outages or security instances to the organization. Are there other vendor controls like that we should consider, including our contracts with vendors that either have access to sensitive data or store our data on their systems?
Yeah.
This is a question for Kirk and Paul. Yeah, Kirk.
Yeah, so absolutely. If the data is being shared with a vendor, you need to understand what that data is and how it's being shared, and what the safeguards are for that. So one of the things that we look at when we're actually storing data in a vendor's cloud platform, we're looking for encryption. We're also looking for the question of, is it encrypted just to protect it against outside hackers, or is the encryption something that we're managing ourselves so even the vendor can't see what's contained within the data? And so that's an important distinction to understand. Are you in control of the encryption keys, and are you actually hiding the data from the vendor, or does the vendor have visibility into it? Within the healthcare space, if the vendor has visibility into it, then you probably have to have a business associate agreement where that's a specific type of contractual document that's required under HIPAA that says, the vendor has an obligation to have security safeguards in place. The vendor has an obligation to alert you if there's a breach. All of those standard things are taken care of. If, however, you're managing the encryption yourself and you're confident that the controls are in there, that even the vendor can't see the contents of the data, then that's a different kind of relationship. And that's really kind of optimal for you as an organization, because you really haven't shared it with the vendor. You've shared something that the vendor can't see.
Yeah. Yeah, Paul, we've been talking a lot about the responsibilities on the institution side. What can vendors do to ensure that they are meeting institutions' needs from a risk and security standpoint?
That's absolutely a great question. So I would say I would tackle that one how I like to tackle most problems, right, at a foundational level. I would say the number one thing I would say to a vendor that's looking to, like, what are some of the best ways that we can protect the privacy and security of our customers' data is, number one, train your people, right? Train everybody within the organization and the importance of privacy and security. Train them how to identify malicious looking behavior, what that looks like. And in the event that it happens, how do you respond to it? How do you report it? I think this is one of the most simple ways to move into what I would say would be the second point, which is working tirelessly to create a culture of privacy and security. So not only do those folks need to be trained on what to do, how to identify it, you need to actually work on building that culture. There may be a handful, usually it's maybe one or two, but there may be a handful of people like Kirk or myself at a vendor or an institution that really, really are passionate and care about privacy and security, but we cannot watch the keystrokes and the displays of every single person in the organization. So if those folks don't take it seriously for themselves and believe that to be a culture of the organization, I think that's a major miss for any vendor. So I'd say prioritize making sure to create that culture, that everybody understands the role that they play in privacy and security and how their actions affect the end users and the customers, and essentially treating other people's data like you would like yours to be treated. And then I would say last but not least, and I always kind of like to end with this, is like sometimes stuff happens. So have a backup plan, right? You can invest all you want into the latest privacy and security tools. You can have the highest paid engineers with the most credentialing. You can have, you can be assessing vendors on a semi-annual or, quarterly basis, wherever the case may be. But sometimes things happen, and I will say the unpopular thing. If there is an adversary out there that really, really wants to breach an organization, they are going to get in, right? That is really important to understand. I know it's not popular to hear, but most things that happen, it's kind of like, it's kind of like petty theft, those types of things, right? What do they tell you? Don't leave your wallet or your keys sitting on the seat of your car, right? That's an easy way to make sure your car or your wallet doesn't get stolen. But at the end of the day, if for some reason some thief or a criminal wants to get into that car, they are going to get in. So you need to have some type of backup or plan to how to address that if that were to happen, right? Hope is not a strategy. So after you've created that plan, you got to make sure that you actually test it, right? And I would say, I come from the great state of Florida, where we have our share of very interesting weather that happens during the summer. And one of the most common things that makes me shake my head, but I see it year after year after year, are folks that, they go and get the nice new shiny generator. They have everything set, ready to go. They go to start their generator. They realize, oh, I don't have oil for the generator. Or, hey, maybe I bought the generator 5-6 years ago, but I haven't used it that much. It works great. They go to try to start it up. It doesn't start, right? Because the carburetor is gummed up or whatever the case may be. The value of testing your preps. Don't just wait until something happens. Run through your tests, do tabletop sessions, and make sure you understand how to navigate those situations before the pressure's on.
Yeah, no, I knew that the hardest part of my job this afternoon would be to end the conversation. There's so many various aspects to this, but Kirk, maybe we'll leave the last word for you. Maybe you can offer a couple tips for assessing risk from a buyer perspective.
Yeah, as you're getting your program started, or as you're maturing your program, just some things to keep in mind. Don't try to do too much at once. Like the saying goes, don't try to boil the ocean. Look at what's the most important, look at what has the most impact for your organization, and make sure you're focusing on that first. And once you have that part figured out, then you can start to work to the lower and lower level of risk until you have a program that's going to encompass, a process for all of the technology that you're trying to onboard and that you're trying to use. And another thing is, there's always risk out there, and you always have to be prepared for it, and keep in mind all of the different kinds of things that might go wrong, and have those on your checklist. But also make sure that when you're designing your controls, make sure that your controls are appropriate for the risk. Make sure that you don't try to get over enthusiastic and put too many controls around it, because the result of that is that then people will find a way to work around your assessment process, and that's not the thing that you want to happen. So as you're designing controls, make sure that the controls match the risk. As one of my colleagues always likes to say, don't buy $1,000 fence for $100 goat. So, if something is a low risk, then put a low cost control in there to manage it. If something is a high risk, make sure that you're putting in a control that's sufficiently strong to be able to deal with that high risk.
Great, Kirk. Thanks so much. And I see that our time is just about up, so I'm going to wrap things up here. I'd like to thank the panel today for a very informative presentation. And I'd like to thank all the audience members for joining us as well, along with that great question there. As a reminder, you'll get a slide you'll get an email within the next few days that contains a link to this recording along with the slides. Thanks again for participating, and have a great day. Kirk, Paul, thanks very much.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.